I came across the island by chance. Before leaving home for my holiday, I quickly, and without a great deal of discernment, downloaded a number of travel guides to the region. One of these described the island. I subsequently discovered that the guide had been given no Amazon stars by the various reviewers who claimed to have read it. One reviewer described it as a work of pure fiction, and another referred to some glaring inaccuracies. My own visit, however, suggests that it is likely to be correct in all major respects. According to the guide, the island had recently recovered from a long period of civil war. This in itself made the island interesting to me, and when I arrived at the mainland port, I was somewhat surprised to find that very few other holiday makers were boarding the ferry. I assumed that most people were somewhat put off by the prospect of traveling to a place only recently embroiled in savage conflict. Although it could also have been quite due to the early winter sailing time. Since my attempts to engage the few other passengers in conversation failed, I climbed on deck and watched the mainland fade into the distance. On arrival, I was not entirely surprised to find the streets of the island's capital deserted. I assumed that decades of war had ingrained in the inhabitants a tendency to remain sheltered. Most likely, the arrival of a boat had for many years been a grim reminder of the war. From my hotel, I noticed that the castle was undergoing repair. According to the guide, this was due to a mortar attack the previous year, in the final days of the Civil War. At the Tourist Information Office, my questions regarding the war were met with apparent confusion. I decided this was due either to my strange accent or to an unwillingness to relive what must have been deeply traumatic events. I decided not to delve further. The next day, I decided to visit a small harbor south of the capital. According to the guide, this had once been a thriving fishing village, but decades of war had irradiated the seas and killed the fish, and therefore the local economy. Although the seas were no longer dangerous, they provided no food for the hundreds of seabirds that inhabited the area. According to the guide, these had learned to hunt for food on land, but continued to nest by the water out of habit. On my way back to the capital, I passed the ruins of many small buildings scattered across the moorland. The guide informed me that these were the remains of rebel households. A government scheme had been introduced to encourage the rebuilding of these for use as holiday homes according to the Scandinavian model. Many were also reserved for members of the armed forces recovering from various forms of combat stress and psychological trauma. Rudimentary and lacking most amenities, these brightly colored, simple cottages offered immediate access to the countryside and the fresh air. Whilst I could see that these might offer some troubled souls a necessary healing solitude, it also occurred to me that a prolonged period of isolation in such a remote and barren location might equally drive an already fragile mind completely insane. The next morning I traveled west. I was delighted by the island's rugged beauty, although I noted that there were few native trees. It seems that the almost total deforestation during the war had forced the islanders to rely heavily on traditional forms of fuel. According to the guide, the extensive use of peat had led to a remarkable discovery. In digging for fuel, the islanders had uncovered what was acknowledged to be the remains of a prehistoric zoo. Archaeologists were still engaged in establishing the limits of the site, and so the guide was vague on its exact location. It stated, however, that the perfectly preserved remains of 2 adult chimpanzees, a giant anteater, a panther, and 2 Bactrian camels had been removed and taken to the island's museum. This sadly was closed when I visited. In the afternoon, I visited the remains of a farmhouse that, according to the guide, had been the summer home of composer Henry Mancini. I read with some fascination that in the early days of the war, Mancini had fought alongside the rebels until recalled to Hollywood to compose the score for the film Breakfast at Tiffany's. In his absence, his home had been destroyed. He had never returned. On my way back to the hotel, I saw the remains of burned-out military vehicles, but I noted with pleasure that the government was rebuilding the island's infrastructure. Communication and power were being brought back to the interior. I therefore took advantage of the superb 3G network to download the new adult J.K. Rowling novel. This turned out to be something of a disappointment when I read it later in the hotel. I had also read in the guide that during the war many of the island's sheep had been contaminated with radiation, and that this had caused genetic mutations. It was suspected that the sheep had evolved a much higher level of intelligence, although they were still farmed somewhat guiltily by the islanders. Feeling somewhat reproached by the stares of the sheep I encountered, I avoided the roast lamb served at dinner that evening. Although I saw many churches, the guide failed to mention that Christianity was practiced on the island. I take this omission to be one of the glaring inaccuracies referred to by reviewers of the guide, which did, in contrast, devote much space to a discussion of the pagan beliefs of many of the islanders. My attention was drawn therefore to the numerous megalithic structures dotted across the landscape. These bore a strong resemblance to the stone heads of Easter Islands, but with difference of being constructed to resemble four-sided faces. According to the guide, this design enabled the monuments to symbolize the islanders' god's omniscience. I noted also that each megalith was positioned directly adjoining a road. This, I assumed, was to enable the islanders to worship with greater ease, and indeed, I witnessed many people disembark from public buses at several megalithic sites during my visit. I decided to travel as far inland as possible. According to the guide, although the war was over, a handful of rebels had sought sanctuary in the mountains of the far north, and it was, at the time of publication, still dangerous to approach these. I was, however, curious, and I pride myself on a certain degree of fearlessness. Deep inland, I discovered what the guide described as an abandoned rebel command post. I crawled inside to eat my packed lunch, drink some coffee, and listen to Moon River on my headphones. On the way back, I visited the remains of a castle that the guide informed me had inspired Victor Hugo to write Le Comte de Monte Cristo. It had latterly been used as a rebel stronghold. Clearly, the guide was wrong on this point, since the author of Le Comte de Monte Cristo was Alexandre Dumas. Returning to the capital, I was concerned to see what seemed to be signs of renewed conflict. That evening, I was alarmed by an increase in activity around what the guide identified as a military airbase. At the hotel, my questions regarding military activity were fielded, and the staff feigned ignorance. Worried that the rebels had gathered strength and were mounting another attack, I decided it was time to leave. Standing on board the deserted ferry back to the mainland, the next morning I watched the island vanish into the distance. I was saddened by the thought that the island might sink beneath the weight of bitter conflict, but also by the sudden realization that I had left my favorite thermos flask inside the rebel command post the previous day. Like Mancini, I would never see the island again.